In this video, we're going to briefly introduce Git and GitHub to show how to use GitHub pages to create a static web page that's available to the entire internet. Let's start with just a little bit of vocabulary. First, version control. Version control is essential in software development. It helps track changes, collaborate with others, and manage different versions of your project. Since changes in software often require multiple files to be modified and tracked in sync, a system that can be used to manage these complex relationships is essential. Git is a popular software that enables version control for projects. More on Git in just a minute. GitHub, separate from Git, is a popular platform for hosting Git repositories or databases. It offers many features like collaboration tools, issue tracking, and project management. Finally, GitHub Pages is a free service that allows you to host static web pages directly from a GitHub repository. It's perfect for hosting personal portfolios, project documentation, and more. While there are several other platforms for doing similar things, most all of them expect the files to be stored in GitHub anyway. So this is the most straightforward approach for our purposes. A little more on Git. So Git is an open source distributed source code management system. It was developed by Linus Torvalds, the inventor of Linux, as a way to collaborate on source code with other developers. While there are several other systems that did the same thing when Linus invented Git, none were open sourced, and he didn't care for how they worked. Git has grown into an industry standard through the ubiquitous use in open source projects and is adapted into several different platforms, including GitHub, GitLab, Bitbucket, and others. Git is helpful because it allows us to track changes in multiple files at the same time with timestamps and comments about who, when, and why changes were made. And since the changes are submitted together, they can be applied or undone as a package without having to keep track of which version of a particular file goes with a version of another file. It helps us to keep those files in sync. There are two parts to a Git repository, which you can think of as kind of a database of changes. So each repository being a database of those changes. There is a local repository and a remote repository. The local repository stores a collection of changes called commits. Then when these changes are ready to be shared, they're merged into the shared remote repository, which typically lives on a server either in your data center or in the cloud, hosted by one of the platform providers that we mentioned earlier, GitHub, Bitbucket, GitLab, or another. GitHub is a popular platform for hosting Git repositories. Additionally, it offers many other features for collaboration like issue tracking and project management. And for our purposes, it even hosts static web pages called GitHub Pages. We'll talk about that next. GitHub was launched in 2008, and it's been in the place for open source projects for a very long time, including ones sponsored by big companies like Microsoft, Facebook, Amazon, and Google. Yeah, that means that you actually have the ability to take a look at code from some of the projects by those companies or some of your other favorite open source tools. You can download the code and you can even offer changes to the mainstream projects using this tool. This slide shows a few of the common Git commands. You'll likely use a few others. These get you started, and we'll walk through exactly what these look like in just a minute. But let's give you an overview of them first, and then you can come back and take a look at these as you're working with Git later on. So starting first, the clone command. The clone command is used to make a local copy of a remote repository onto your machine. That is, so you can copy from the repository that's in GitHub or GitLab, Bitbucket, or in your local data center onto your machine where you're creating that local repository. It only needs to be once. It only needs to be done once, and that's when the project is started. So every time you start a new project, the very first step you'll do is do a clone. And then updating the machine with changes on the server are done using the pull command later on. We'll talk about that in just a minute. Add is used to stage changes before they're formally moved into the local database. Oftentimes, this step is combined with the next step called commit, which is the one that stamps the files with the changes into the local repository. When the files are committed, the user needs to provide a comment that states what the change was, why the change was made, and then the system applies a timestamp and your user ID so that we can track who the change was made and when it was made. Next, when a collection of changes are ready to be shared, the push command is used to merge the changes into the shared repository. Notice I said merged, not copied. This is one of the great things about Git and one of the reasons we need the stage section. If someone else made a change at the same time that I make a change and I want to update the same file or a shared copy, my changes are automatically combined with the new changes before they are pushed to the shared repository. So they're actually auto merged and reconciled. Of course, there's times when the computer can't figure out exactly how to combine the files. I may have changed the exact same line that you changed on the remote repository. In these cases, um, they do represent a conflict, but often, and then we'll have to manually modify the conflict. But often, the automatic merge is effective, and it's really fantastic. When I want to get changes from the shared or remote repository, I execute the pull command. Like I said earlier, only the first time that we need a copy of the remote repository do we need a clone. Subsequent updates are done with a pull command. And so if we want to get the changes on the server down locally, we start with a pull, and then we make our changes typically, and then we will commit and push them back up to the server. Note that some tools combine the whole push pull aspect. So when we're ready to move our changes up to the server, we first have to get the changes from the server to make sure that we're updating the latest version. And so some tools combine that push pull into a single sync command. But this isn't a git command per se. It's just typically a button in the tool that we're using. And while git is often run as a command line tool, um, the commands that I've listed here are also built into a variety of different clients, which provide a user-friendly interface. So for instance, Visual Studio Code and GitHub Desktop are two popular ones. For this discussion, we'll be using the GitHub Desktop tool. So let's take a few minutes to see what a typical workflow looks like on paper. Then we'll move into seeing this for real. Let me say, Git comes with lots and lots more commands and features that are very powerful. We're just focusing on the ones required to help you get a repository set up for your personal use to post a GitHub's pages website. There are tons and tons of resources on the web to help explain the concept in all different ways, and plenty of references if you need. So when we're working with Git, we need a common place for everyone to be able to get files from and to share files from. And that storage location we're going to call our remote repository from now on. We can see right here, we have a remote repository. And in order to get, everyone will create local copies of this remote repository, and we will interact directly with this location to make updates and share files. The remote repository is typically on a server somewhere. It can be in the cloud. In our particular case, we'll be using GitHub. It's as we kind of explained earlier, it's a very popular online tool that was bought by Microsoft. They kind of run it, and we'll use the repositories there. Okay, so once we have our remote repository set up, the next thing we need to do is be able to get our files locally. To get our files from the remote repository down to our own desktop, we're going to use a command. The very first time, we need to use a utility or command called clone. Clone makes a copy of all the files in the remote repository down to our local working directory, any directory we choose. So this can be in a temporary directory on your computer, your profile directory, any folder on your computer. And it also makes us a copy, a local repository, a exact same kind of setup, the same kind of database that we have here on the server, except that we make a local copy of it. And when we do this clone command, we get the files copied into a working directory, and we get our local repository created with the files in it. The next step, when we want to actually add new files to our project, we've already cloned them from the remote repository, so they exist here already. You'll notice index.html exists here already. We want to add another file, let's say second.html. We're going to do a command called add. And you're going to do this a lot. Whenever you create new files or change files, you'll need to add them, which puts them in a staging area. This gives us an opportunity to put multiple changes of files over time, so we can have a third file here if we wanted, and a fourth file, and we don't have to add them all at once. We can add them as they are appropriate and when they're complete. And so adding files here moves them into a staging area. From the staging area, we need to be able to move our files into our local repository. So our first step was the add. Getting files from our working directory into the staging area. The second step is what we call a commit. Now, when we commit files, that's saying we're taking all the files that are currently in our staging area and we're putting them into our local repository. We're making a copy of them and we want to stamp them. The commit is great because it allows us to add comments on exactly what these changes include. So if we're including a whole ton of different files at once, say we're adding second, third, and fourth files, we're making a change, we're moving all of those changes in one transaction to our local repository. We call that a commit. When we commit, we get the comments that are associated with them, the reason that we're moving those files in there, so we have history, so we know why we made changes and and why we made the versions. And the second thing we have is we know who made the changes and when they were made. And so that's super helpful for us, especially when we're collaborating with lots of different people, or for when we want to go back and look at our changes after the fact. Fantastic. Now that we've moved our changes into our local repository, we need to go ahead and share those changes back to the remote repository. And so, once again, we've done our first step, the add, which moved them to the staging area. The reason this is a kind of in a not filled in box is because the staging area is a temporary location. Once we commit and get them moved into our local repository, here the files are actually removed from the staging area. Now, getting our changes, once we have a set of commits or oftentimes a single commit completed, we want to be able to move this particular file or make sure that our changes are synced up with our remote repository. In order to sync them up with our remote repository, we do a command called a push. So now our files have been added to our staging area. We've applied some comment to them, some comment and a timestamp. Comment, a user, and a timestamp. And then we've gone ahead and once we've made our changes, we push them, and now they're in the remote repository for everyone else to be able to get at them. Now, that's great and fine, but how do we get these files from the remote repository back out to the other remote repositories here and here? We don't want to use a push because that would say that everyone has to have server access and can go on the server and make changes and push them out, and we may not want that to be the case. We don't want to use a clone because a clone creates a brand new local repository for us. So in order to get the changes back from the server to the local repository, on our local machine, we will do a pull. Also sync. A pull is the actual command that we're going to use. We're going to do a pull from the remote repository to our local, and that will copy the files pull locally. The sync command actually does a combination of both push and pull. So if we happen to have changes that that we've created here, like maybe we've created a third HTML file and we haven't committed it to our remote repository, we can use sync to both do the push and the pull at the same time. Here's a slide for a quick reminder of the main workflow: the clone, the add / commit, the push, the pull, the commit, the staging, the committing, and then the pushing. GitHub offers a tool called GitHub Pages, which offer a place to host a static website with the files stored in GitHub. As I've said before, there's lots of other platforms that provide a similar service, but most all of them use GitHub as the file repository anyway. So we didn't see a need to complicate things by introducing new sites and tools. There are 5 steps to creating a new repository and getting it hosted on GitHub Pages. They're listed here. First, create the repository on GitHub. You'll need to create an account on GitHub. I suggest using a username that's professional, not the nickname you use to set your fantasy football team. Your username will be part of the URL for your portfolio, and so it'd be embarrassing to send a link to rabidunicorn/portfolio to the prospective employers. Once you've created the repository on GitHub, you'll want to clone the repository to your machine. GitHub will walk you through exactly how to go about this. For our example, we're using GitHub Client, so you may want to download that as well, either after you create the repository or before. Next, we're going to add some files to our local working directory and local repository. You'll see as I walk through the demo in a second that I named the file index.html. This is important because the default file that all web pages look for, if you don't specify a file in the URL, is index.html. If you're building a repository that's not a website, then it doesn't really matter what you name that file. Fourth, we need to push our changes back to the remote repository. This makes them available on GitHub. And then 5, we configure the GitHub pages. This is adjustments in our remote repository. We can do it at any time, but it only needs to be done once. You'll see in the demonstration that once we've done it once, any changes that we push up to our repository are automatically posted to the web once they've been pushed back into the remote repository. Finally, once we've completed these 5 steps, then our updates, any updates we need to make are just simply repeating steps 3 and 4 until we have all the pages we want or all the changes we want on our web page. Let's take a look. All right, time to take a look at how to create GitHub pages. And really, this first few steps is just an overview of how to use Git to create our repositories and to work with it, both a remote and a local repository. And then we'll deal with how to turn it into a GitHub Pages project. So we'll start here in GitHub. If you've created an account and you go to your GitHub account, you'll be on your kind of home page. And when I click on my account in particular, or select my account rather, you can see that this is kind of my profile page, the one that comes up when I put in my username. This can be modified if you create a special kind of GitHub profile, but we're not going to deal with that just today. So the first thing we want to do is create a new repository. We start with the repository in GitHub. Remember the 5 steps we talked about before. The first step is to create a repository. So we go here to the upper right hand corner and we create a new repository. Creating a new repository is pretty straightforward. We can give it a repository name. In our case, let's call this demo profile. You may change it and specify it to be profile, or you can call it whatever you'd like. And then we want to put in a description just so we can keep up with it ourselves. And this is a demonstration profile for showing off how to do GitHub pages. Perfect. We don't need to click any of these other buttons. We want it to be public so that we can see it on the internet. We don't need a README for this one because it's specifically, we're just focused on the index.html page. We don't need to worry about git ignore or licenses. If we're doing actual software development and doing a software project, then likely we would add a README. This is kind of description of the product, a long description of the project, how to install it, things like that. A git ignore says which files should I not include in the repository, even though they're on my desktop and maybe in that particular folder. And then choosing a license says what people can do with your code, what they can't do with your code. It kind of protects you from a creative license standpoint. So we're not worrying about any of that because we're just creating a repository, and it's unlikely somebody else is going to want to use our profile as their own kind of work. It wouldn't be their repository anyway. So we'll go ahead and create our repository. Now, the first time we create the repository, it will come up with this great set of instructions here. We can, it tells us right away here in the quick step that if we've done this before, we can actually jump in and just get going using this URL. It also tells us the steps we can do on the command line. If we have, we can open the command line, paste these steps in once we've installed Git on our computer, and make it go from there. And if we already have files on our local desktop, this is kind of more advanced situation, then we can push those there. But we're going to do the simplest approach, and we're just going to set it up in GitHub Desktop. I installed GitHub Desktop over here just a little bit ago, and we're all set to go. So you'll notice when we do setup in desktop, that it immediately opened up GitHub Desktop. It pasted in the URL, and it says, where do you want to put your files? I choose to keep all my files on a separate disk, the D drive in my projects folder, and since this is called demo project, this will be in the D projects demo folder. You're welcome to choose whatever folder makes the most sense for you. You know, it's possible that you have, you know, you can put it in your personal directory, you can put it in your OneDrive folder, whatever you'd like. We're going to go ahead and stick with the demo drive. And so now this is step 2, right? This is cloning the repository to the local machine. So we now have our local repository. And if we go take a look here, if we show it in Explorer, Windows Explorer, and we'll bring that window down over here, you'll notice that we have the this .git folder in our project's demo profile folder on my PC. That is our database, or our local repository. So we have no files. We don't mess with this. This is what's handled by Git. If we want to add a file, for instance, this is where we would go ahead and put it in the folder. So we're going to go ahead and create a new text document. Our new text document, remember, we want to name it index.html. So I'm going to go ahead and just create index.html right there. And I'm going to change the extension, that's fine. Next thing we want to do is we want to edit this particular file. So take a look at our index.html in Notepad. This is a very simple profile. Notice it just has the basics. It's got our HTML tag, our header tag that says this is my profile, the body tag, and we can add all the rest of the info we want here. But at this point, we have our index.html. We're going to go ahead and save this file. Ensure that it's been updated. Very good. This file has been updated, and we can take a look at it real quick on our machine. Looks great. We have our My Simple portfolio that works great on our machine, so we're good to go. All right, so we've added a file to the path. Go back over here. That was step 3. Step 4 is to publish our changes to GitHub. Notice the GitHub client noticed that we added a file. We have one changed file, and all of these lines are green here. That means that we've added, you see this little plus sign, we've added lines to this particular file. And so the next step is to stage these and then commit them. You'll recall from the previous video, or the previous instructions in the video. And so we want to make a comment about what the change was, and in this particular case, I'm good with the comment here, create index.html, and we can just say this is our initial commit. Now, as we said, most often tools like this kind of hide the whole stage commit 2-step process and turn it into just 1 step. And so we're going to go ahead and commit our change to main. Now remember that we've only committed our change to the local repository. So our local repository still has the one file in it. It doesn't have, and we can see the history of the file here. It doesn't, those changes have not been published back to the GitHub, yet. And so we need to go ahead and publish our changes. this is where you'll notice that the tool just kind of drags us through. We can go ahead and publish our branch. And so we will do that. So we'll publish our branch. This happens the very first time. We're pushing our changes up to GitHub. And when we go back over to our GitHub window here and refresh in our code window, we'll see we now have the index.html file that's been uploaded, and it has the contents that we created there. Fantastic. So we've done our first change and commit. One more thing we'll do, since we're just looking at Git real quick, we've pushed our changes up to GitHub. The next thing we would do is to create our GitHub page. And so let's go ahead and do that real quick. Back to our GitHub repository. This is our remote repository. One time we go into our settings, and over on the left-hand side in this set of menus, we see pages. Click on that pages. When we get to pages, we'll see that there's a bunch of information about GitHub pages, and click the links and read all about it. It says we want to deploy our GitHub pages from a branch. Our primary branch in this particular case is main. No need to worry about other branches at this point. Kind of a branch is we think of it as that that kind of starting point from where our changes are saved. And so we have one main branch, and so we need to check the branch that it is that we're going to post from. So we'll select our main branch. The file is in the root directory. We haven't created a docs directory. We haven't created any other directories in that. So we'll just use the root directory. And when we hit save, this will take just a few minutes. But this is, we'll kind of let this churn a little bit. Okay, after about 20 or 30 seconds and a few refreshes, you'll notice that we finally get this box here that says your site is live, and it gives us the URL to our site, mlders.github.io/demo profile, and we can go ahead and visit our site. So let's take a look at what that looks like. There we go. We are now looking at an internet site with our portfolio page on it. That's pretty fantastic. Let's do this just for, all right, great. So we have our portfolio site. Now, that portfolio isn't very interesting. It's only got a few things on it. It would be really nice if we kind of added a few more kind of aspects to it. We've talked about, adding some styles and some colors and things like that. So let's go ahead and add a few more files and update our index file. Okay, so a couple things we want to do. First off, I have an image to add to our site. So I'm going to go ahead and create a new folder. I like to keep kind of images and that kind of thing in separate folders, just for I know it's a common website kind of setup. So I'm going to create a new folder called IMG, and in that folder, I'm going to go ahead and drag in my my mugshot. Fantastic. I also want to change this this index.html, the main file. I want to include a little bit better content. So I've got this new file I'll show you just in 1 second. We're going to delete our old index file, and we're going to rename this one to index.html. And you'll see in here, this just is a nicer looking file. We've got some styles defined here. We've got a little bit more added to our portfolio. We've got a few containers, div containers and that kind of thing. So it's going to look a lot nicer. And so remember that we need to keep it named index.html if we want it to show up on our site. So back over to the GitHub desktop, we notice that we have, there we go, there's the mug shot, and we've got some changes to the index.html file. Notice these lines have been removed. They're in red, and these lines have been added. They're in green. So we've made some changes. So now we're updating two files at once, and so we need to make a summary of those changes. And so I'm going to say add mugshot and change up the portfolio page. And in my description, I can be a little more verbose. I can say, I wanted a cleaner portfolio page with some pictures and better styling. And I'm going to go ahead and commit it. Remember that I've made my changes just locally once again, and it tells me immediately that I need to push the changes to the remote. And so I have one commit that I can push to the remote. I'm going to go ahead and push. It's called origin is what they'll call the remote. No need to worry about it, but it kind of guides us through what happened. We made the change, we posted it there. Now, no more changes need to happen on our GitHub page. We've already made the pages. You'll notice that our new folder is here with our mugshot image, and our mugshot image has been uploaded. Our index file has been added and changed. We've got the new styles in here, etc. And it probably take just a minute or two. We'll give this a minute. And in about 30 seconds or so, I came back and refreshed my URL, and look at that. Our page is now live on the internet. Nothing else to do. And if I want to continue to make changes, I can make them on my desktop here in Notepad, right? Editing in Notepad. I can make changes here in Notepad. I decide I don't really want paragraphs to be read anymore, so I take that off. Once again, saving the file. I go back over to my GitHub desktop. Notice it says it recognized that there was a change, so I can say I've updated or removed the red on the paragraphs. I think that's enough description. I commit locally. I push my changes to GitHub. I wait about 30 seconds. And after about 30 seconds, you can see my changes have been updated on the web. We just continue to repeat those two steps. Make changes locally, save our changes, commit them locally, and then push them to the repository, and it's all updated, ready to go for us. Simple as that.